Hello everyone, welcome to Flourish Well's YouTube channel. Today we are exploring a question that sits at the heart of every truly thriving school. What does real well-being in schools actually look like? Not as a slogan, not as a policy statement, because most of the times schools will talk about well-being, but many are confused that what actually well-being looks like. I'm delighted to be joined by David Bott, co-founder of the Wellbeing Distillery, and he's also a member of the Dubai Future Council for Education. David, who works with government organizations and some of world's leading schools to help guide well-being vision and strategy. We are so delighted to have you with us, David, this morning.
Thank you, Binu. Appreciate you. It's looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. So to move forward, you have been seeing schools across more than 25 countries. When you first step into a school, before anyone says a word, what tells you that well-being is really there? Not just something that the school talks about. It is actually there in every dealings, every action, and every word of the school. So what is that something you have observed?
Yeah, this is such an important question, Binu, because what you're really asking is what does embedded well-being look like when it's not a program or it's not a thing that we do, but it's actually placed at the heart of a school. And so this question has really been driving my career for the last 20 years, trying to answer this question and understand what really enables schools to place well-being at the heart of a school. And so to answer your question, I walk into a lot of schools. I think this week I've walked into 3 different schools in Melbourne, Australia, and you always get a sense of well-being as soon as you walk in that open the front door. And well-being really isn't it's not about the posters on the wall or the policy document. It's kind of it's the stuff between the stuff, if you know what I mean. It's how the receptionist greets you. It's how the students move through corridors. It's where the adults and students make eye contact with each other. We might refer to this as the climate of a school. Like how does it feel? And climate is a result, and climate and culture within a school are the result of thousands and thousands of micro moments of interaction. As you know, within schools are pretty strange places, and a typical school in Australia or in India might have 4 different generations of people working inside of it. There might be a 5-year-old or even a 4 or 3-year-old child sometimes in some early learning centers, through to an 80-year-old, receptionist or history teacher or something. And so there are these huge gaps in people's motivations, in their life experience. They're unusual places and they're complex. And so you have these 4 different generations, or 2 or 3 generations of people moving in, all doing different jobs. Some people are trying to run the finance of the school. Some people are trying to teach kids to read and write. Some people are trying to clean up the dining hall, perhaps. All these people doing so many different jobs across different spans of life. And it's what Dr. John Haidt calls a complex dynamical system. Schools are highly complex places, which means there are thousands and thousands of micro interactions happening every single hour, every single day of a school. And culture and climate is the accumulation of these micro moments. And that's why well-being really isn't about policies and procedures and programs. Well-being is really about the what occurs in the magical, sacred space between an educator and a child, or in a conversation between a colleague and a leader, or between 2 different teachers. It's in those moments of interaction that well-being, culture, and climate emerges. To give you an example of 2 different climates or 2 different well-being cultures that I've seen recently. We're kind of in the end of term 1 in the school year in Australia. So the school year starts in February here in Australia. And I went to 2 different school assemblies with 2 different schools at the start of the school year here. And these were the opening assemblies for the opening of the year. All of the students in both schools were in both assemblies. So on the Monday, I visited one school, sat in an opening assembly. The principal gave an address. And the principal of this school is very, very good. Both are very excellent schools, and both with excellent heads of school. But one principal stood up and said, last year we did okay, and the results were okay, but they weren't very strong. And we've got some challenges, and we had some issues with staff, and it wasn't a great year. We want to do better. There's some challenges we're facing, and it wasn't a really great year to celebrate. It was this kind of very negative perspective on last year wasn't great. And you could sort of feel the air sucked out of the room. Like people were kind of starting to fold their arms. This is, day one, the first moment. I went to an assembly on the Wednesday, 2 days later, different school. Same opening assembly, new principal opening the year for the school. And the principal starts with just standing on the stage with no notes, 1,000 people in the audience, students and staff. And she told a story of a student who'd overcome a significant challenge and been supported by the community to have hope about moving forward. And they'd overcome this amazing kind of experience through the support of the community. And in that assembly, you felt everybody lean in. It was just this kind of collective, kind of like almost a collective hug. Like, we're in this together. This is an amazing community. And those two opening scenes of the year really represented the two different cultures and climates in the school. And this is what wellbeing really is about. It's those moments that matter, that make people feel either connected or disconnected to the community they're part of.
Thanks, David, because it's so important to know that, that complex dynamic, you mentioned strange is actually strange because those micro moments that we create. And the sad part is like, sometimes we intentionally, we forget to create those micro moments. When we create those micro moments, this magic actually happens. Yeah, that's actually a good call for all of us to think about it. So to continue with that, we understand today that well-being is deeply important for students, staff, relationship, and even learning outcomes because we need to create those micro moments. But if you already know that, why do so many schools still struggle to actually put it into practice?
I think if we start with the impact, right? So the research that we have made clear that students who feel that they belong, who feel connected to their educators, who feel a sense of community, who feel a sense of meaning in their school, have a sense of autonomy. They don't just feel better, they learn better, right? Wellbeing isn't a nice to have. It's not something we put alongside academics. It's the foundation that academic learning sits on. But unfortunately, in India, still in Australia, in countries, in schools all around the world, we still have this wellbeing versus results kind of dichotomy that gets set up, or well-being versus academia. There's this pervasive kind of legacy argument that interferes with what you and I know, and that is that well-being causes strong academic learning, right? So first of all, we have to name this gap. And I also think that, most schools aren't struggling because they don't care. They're not struggling with well-being because they fail to care. They're struggling because they're doing dozens of disconnected things. They're doing busy well-being, right? They have a resilience program here, and then a counselor over there, and then they've got a mindfulness app and a values poster and all these kind of busy well-being things. But the problem isn't effort, it's fragmentation, right? It's a disconnected, non-strategic approach to well-being. And so without this kind of coherent approach, well-being becomes a collection of busy initiatives that compete for time rather than kind of supporting and compounding each other. And so what this kind of leads to, and I know you've seen this as well in schools that you've worked with, is that we end up with initiative fatigue, or idea fatigue, or this kind of response that, we're doing another well-being thing, or it's just another period on a Thursday afternoon for students, or it's another pastoral thing that a teacher has to do when they don't really want to. So what we're trying to do is allow schools to see that that when we have a coordinated, strategic, coherent approach, well-being is not another thing to do, and it doesn't compete with academic learning. It becomes just who we are. This is the way we do things around here, that which is what culture is about, right? And when we get to that place, not only is it not another thing to do, but actually a well-designed well-being program creates less things to do because there are less challenges, less problems. There's less mental health issues. There's less physical health issues. There's less disruption in classrooms. There's less behavioral problems. There's less staff discontent. So well-being, when it's done properly, strategically, coherently, and is kind of an enabler in a school. But the work you and I and the field are trying to do is help people see that this is not well-being versus academics, that this is really placing well-being at the heart of a school enables academic learning to thrive and flourish, as well as the well-being of students and the community.
Yeah, thanks, David, because that is actually what we needed now. Because many schools feel like by giving time or allotting time for well-being, that actually takes away their major chunk from the academic sector. But that how well-being actually going to help the learning aspect of the school and with less issues to deal with, it's actually amazing. And I really wanted to bring out that word that you always mention, well-being adjacent. So that is something which actually create that atmosphere at schools. So in India, if you look at that situation, I would say that post-COVID, in the recent past, the well-being initiatives have increased in exponentially because Supreme Court of India has given a 15-point order, and also CBSE has started really good initiatives to bring that well-being to the core. So I think what is lacking is this understanding that why we need to bring well-being into the core of the school. So to connect with that, so when if a school does build a strong well-being framework, what difference does it really make to the life and success of the school?
Yeah, I was at a school last week, again here in Melbourne, Australia, and it's a school right at the start of its wellbeing journey. And I had a conversation with, I started with the counsellor, the kind of mental health expert in the school, and I asked the counsellor, what does wellbeing mean to you? What are we trying to achieve here? And they were talking about mental health, right? They were really focused on reducing mental health challenges. And then I had a meeting with the principal, and he was talking about creating a positive culture. And then I had a conversation with a physical PE teacher, physical education teacher, and that they talk about resilience. And then I had a conversation with a parent, and they were talking about connection. And they were all talking about the same kind of things, but there was no consistency, no coherence in the language they were using, the direction of the school, the framework of what well-being is about. And so there was no clear understanding, no clear definition or understanding or language around well-being. And so this is what a framework does. A well-being framework, a well-designed well-being framework really does two things. First, it gives the school a shared language, right? So that we avoid this talking about different things. It avoids people circling around the same thing, but never really landing on it together. So a framework helps align the conversation. But secondly, and probably I was going to say more importantly, but I don't think that's true. I think equally important, the second thing a framework does is it changes the question from what program should we buy to what does our community really need. The difference is not going out to the market to try and just pick a nice program or a good looking program or a helpful program, but it's really asking, a framework says, where is our community, what do they need right now, and then creating from that a vision, a strategy, and a plan that's custom, that's bespoke, that's real, that's part of the fabric of the school, that's kind of owned by the school. And so when we do that, it's a very, very different perspective that enables this sense of coherence and strategy that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Thanks, David. Can you give me one or two examples of the schools where they
Yeah,
actually implemented this well-being framework and how is their functioning supports the staff, students, and the wider
yeah.
community?
Yeah, there's a school in South Australia, in Adelaide here, in Australia, that we're working with that's recently just completed the first part of what we call the Wellbeing Compass, which is a whole school survey that enables us to measure the well-being of every individual in the community, but not only their well-being, but also their ability to generate or create well-being for others, which is quite a unique way to think about well-being through a systems lens, right? So typically in well-being, we measure the mental health and well-being of a person, but we tend to fail in schools. We fail to recognize or measure how effectively each person is generating well-being for others. And so we're focusing on both of those things. And when we take a framework-based, strategic whole school systems approach with this school in Adelaide that we're working with, you're able to create measurable differences or demonstrate measurable differences, right? So we're able to demonstrate that we are here, we're at point A, and we're going to do these things, and in 6 months' time, we're at point B. We're able to actually measure that, identify, did that thing work, and which needle are we trying to shift, and were we able to shift it? So that school in Adelaide is taking this very strategic whole school approach that's embedded with an embedded framework and embedded language and a very targeted strategic interventions designed to shift specific needles. So that's one school. I'll tell you a story about another school in Sydney that we've worked with recently as well, one of the leading wellbeing schools in Australia. And they've done a great job of recognizing that there are 4 stakeholders or 4 partner groups inside of every school. There's leadership, then there's educators and support staff, then there's students, and then there's families, right? And typically with wellbeing schools, typically there's a big focus on students, but not enough focus on the educators themselves, because you and I both know that you can have the best wellbeing program for students, you can have the best student wellbeing program in the world, but if the teachers delivering the program are not well, then that program will fail. But there's also another level, and that's leadership, because you can have a great wellbeing program for students, really healthy educators, but if the leadership is poisonous, or if they're not on board, or if they're not inspirational, if they're not creating a strong vision, then the program will fail as well. And of course, then there's families and parents, and I think you've heard me tell this story before, but I've got a 10-year-old son, Hudson, who's going to a very good wellbeing based school in Melbourne, Australia, in Melbourne here. And he has great teachers and great leadership. And he's learning really good skills, wellbeing skills at school. But then he comes home to me, to Dad, who literally brought him into the world, who's teaching him, character, who's out playing golf with him on weekends, who's, literally tucking him into bed and reading to him at night. I have way more impact, far more impact on Hudson's wellbeing than any school ever could. And so the parent, the family, is so fundamental in the well-being of a child, and schools sometimes fail to recognize that that they forget about families and they forget about leadership. And so this school I'm talking about in Sydney, Ravenswood School for Girls, one of the leading wellbeing schools in Australia, where Anne Johnston was the principal of school there, and Kate Barber was leading the wellbeing program. Both those two people have moved on to another school in Australia in the last few months, but Ravenswood led the way, I think, in Australia over the last 5 years, because of the fact that they appreciated that this work has to start with leadership. Get them on board. Make sure teachers are highly trained, highly effective in their work. Make sure we're teaching a really good program to students, and then make sure parents are, a force multiplier, really driving the system as well by using the same language through a shared framework. And all this stuff we were talking about earlier has been implemented across the whole system. And that's where you create this really kind of, we're all singing from the same hymn book, is a common phrase we use. We're all on the same page. We all know where we're heading. We all know what our role is. And each person across the whole community is in the same direction, heading towards the same point, using the same language, using the same framework. And that's where we get this transformation happening in a school. This is not just a cute, nice wellbeing program, but this has actually transformed that school, because they've taken such a well-designed whole school strategic approach.
Thanks, David. This actually takes me to a different area, because as you know that I'm leading more than 220 counselors across India. The common theme which comes up is many schools, it is becoming a counselor's job to make sure that well-being is taken care of. For one counselor for 1,000 students or even 500 students, it's impossible for them to ensure that.
Yeah.
So here comes that point that you emphasized, all four stakeholders. The well-being of all areas, if we bring it together and create a proper well-being framework, I'm sure that our schools are going to do amazingly well to take care of this human core, the child, which we are interested with. So to support with that, we have a National Education Program 2020 that is placing such strong emphasis on holistic development. What do you see as the biggest opportunity for Indian schools right now?
Yeah, I love this. And I had a good look at the National Education Program. And what I love about it is it creates a real opportunity for Indian educators to not only talk about holistic development, but to place it at the center of education policy, but also education implementation. Schools in India now have permission. In fact, it's more than permission, it's a mandate to take wellbeing seriously. The government has said that you must do this wellbeing thing well, which is significant, because in many countries, schools wanting to do this work are really, really kind of trying to break the mold. They're pushing against education policy. But in India now we have, and in Australia, luckily, but India, I think, is really a leader in this field. We have wellbeing and academics kind of side by side. And so schools are not only encouraged, but they're mandated to do this work, which is so exciting. They're not, educators are not, wellbeing educators are not fighting anymore. They have the wind at their backs, if you like. But there is a risk here, and we've seen this in Australia as well, and some other countries around the world, particularly through Southeast Asia, and that is there's a risk that we get compliance without conviction. right? That schools in India tick a box and they say, yes, we've added a 30-minute wellbeing period on a Wednesday, and we've hired an extra counselor, and we're done. But that's the kind of add-on mistake that schools make, and that's bad in one school, but potentially that becomes a national mistake. If schools across India start to do that, that's a disaster and a waste of resources. So we can't have wellbeing just being a compliance thing. It must be about creating this change that we're talking about with this holistic, strategic approach to well-being that is grounded in the education of all members of the community. So, but I also understand that in India, there are real pressures. Like it's lovely, it's great that the Indian government says we've got to take well-being seriously, but there's also real pressures. There's parental, expectations in India are very high on and linked to academic results. Right? We have a board exam culture, very large class sizes, and as you said, limited counselling infrastructure. So, what I think we have to do is then position well-being as enhancing learning, right? I think this well-being for learning concept is really important in India. That we're not just taking Indian schools that have been very good at learning and adding in well-being is another thing to do. What we're actually doing is taking Indian schools who are great at learning, and we're supercharging their learning by placing well-being science-based foundations at the heart of learning. And I think that's how you get this shift from compliance to real passionate kind of conviction that this stuff really matters.
Thanks, David. If I look at the Indian school scenario in the last 1 year, the number of student suicide rate, the self-harm rate, that is increasing exponentially. So if we bring well-being into this scenario of a school, do you have any thought that, how we can change the scenario, or if we are on the opposite side, if we are not taking well-being seriously, how it is going to affect the children's overall well-being and these issues that slowly popping up, how it's going to get worse?
I think if there was one thing that if I had a magic wand, I've just been reading Harry Potter with my son. We're up to the 5th book now, Binu. So if I had a magic wand like Harry Potter, the one thing I would change to kind of immediately is to stop starting with programs. To stop the emphasis on which program should we choose, and to start with the question, what does our community actually need right now? Right. This is the most important thing a school can do, is to pause, right? Just to stop, to take a breath for a minute, and to diagnose before we prescribe. Right. To really listen, like to gather the voices of the community, the students, the staff, the parents, the alumni, even the non-teaching support staff, to really listen and to partner with them to help answer the question, what does this community need right now? But unfortunately, most schools skip this step entirely because it's hard. It takes a bit of time, it takes a bit of energy, but this is the most important step, because otherwise you end up buying a program or launching an initiative and then you wonder why it doesn't work. So that's the first thing I would do. The second thing I would do, that may be a simpler thing, and this is a recommendation for leaders inside of Indian schools, is very simple. It costs nothing, and it will take about 2 minutes a week, and that is to make well-being a standing item on every leadership meeting agenda. Not as a report, like not some sort of detailed data-driven report, but just a question, like, what have we noticed this week about how our people are doing? That single question starts shifting awareness and starts causing people to focus on well-being, to see well-being, and to also help leaders recognize that well-being is not the counselor's job. Well-being is everybody's job, especially leadership. And so when you get leaders starting to ask the question, what are we noticing around well-being? Then we have this shift, this kind of adoption of responsibility, where leaders recognize, yes, this well-being thing is my job. And it's the grade 3 teacher, and it's the history teacher, and it's the gardener, and it's the receptionist, and it's the families, and it's the students. And that's when we start to have this cultural shift. But it starts with leaders asking that very simple question, what have we noticed this week about how our people are doing in terms of well-being? So I hope that's a little helpful start for you, Binu.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for sharing your insights and experience with us. I know last year you joined us for India's first International Wellbeing Conference, and you inspired more than 220 counselors here in India to start this. So you actually started that fire inside us, and we are still carrying it forward. So, this has been such a meaningful and valuable conversation to add to that and to take it forward, especially for school leaders, educators, counselors, and parents who are trying to build school communities where both children and adults also can flourish. And thank you, everyone who joined for this conversation. If this discussion resonated with you, do share it with your educators, school leaders, and others who care deeply about the future of schools and well being. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Binu.